most of governments react to this pandemic as treating this pandemic as something like a standard recession or standard crisis. And do you think that we should think about it this way, or we should make some major difference, major differentiation?
No, I don't think it's a standard crisis at all. It's not an internally generated event like the financial crisis or like the Great Depression, where the mechanics of the economy, the internal functioning of the economy broke down in important respects, with bank failures in the 1930s following the stock market crash, and then the global financial crisis in 2008. Those were sort of internal events. And this is an external event that has caused people to alter their behavior very substantially, in part due to directives from their leaders, their local and state and federal officials, but in part just out of fear. So people have just cut back very drastically on certain types of activity, social and economic activity, and it's not possible to deal with this using standard tools. The standard tools would be monetary and fiscal policy. The stimulus bill that was passed by Congress, the Federal Reserve, invoking the unusual and exigent circumstances clause of the Federal Reserve Act, and they are doing very powerful things. The Federal Reserve trying to intervene in the commercial paper market and the municipal bond market, but these are not going to be sufficient to the task. And the reason is because the external event has to be itself suppressed. And that's what we have been trying to work on with this roadmap to pandemic resilience. Because otherwise, if the virus is not properly dealt with, then we're going to have a resurgence. You're going to have social distancing that is imposed, relaxed, then imposed again, then relaxed again, and you're going to have waves of this. That's our feeling. So we feel that the first order of business is actually, dealing with the virus itself. And for that, the plan that we have proposed envisages a means towards partitioning the population into those who are infected, those who are at risk, and those who are clear, at least for the time being, so that, people can go back to economic and social life if they're temporarily free of the virus. And others can be isolated in a supported way, so that they don't have incentives to break quarantine. And this will allow the economy to come back. But more importantly, it will allow people to trust that those other people who are out with them in the workplace, in the social settings, are themselves have a negative disease test. And that is critical. So the standard monetary and fiscal policies are not going to apply here. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, you did. And because some of the governments, probably even most of governments, they seem to follow this Neil Ferguson's model. I mean, the outcome of this model, this cyclic closing and opening economies. And why do you think you all the authors of the roadmap that this is not the optimum solution?
Basically, because it's going to cost more in human lives, and it's going to cost more in treasure. I mean, the cost of the plans that we are proposing, which is, scaling up testing to the level of 5 million tests a day in the United States by June and 20 million by July, is costly. But the cost over 2 years of what we are proposing is roughly the same as the cost that we are suffering right now per month through the loss of output and employment. So the reason why we think it's inadequate is because we sacrifice more lives under the current scenario, and we sacrifice more economic loss.
And the key tool of this plan of yours is tests, in fact. And there are lots of controversies around tests because they seem to be quite unreliable. There is quite a huge error margin when you use them, and how to eliminate this kind of wobbling nature of those tests.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So you have quite a large percentage, by some estimates as many as 30% false negatives. So people who are actually positive will be certified temporarily as negative, and they will be spreading the virus. And that's a problem, of course, but that's why the number of tests has to be high enough so that you're able to reduce the reproduction rate of the virus below 1, so that it's declining rather than spreading. So you have to scale up the tests. If the tests were more reliable, we could manage with less tests. So that's part of it. But I should say 2 things about the initiative. Firstly, I'm just part of a large team. It is led by Danielle Allen of Harvard University, of the Safra Center. And there are many other people involved. So I would just like you to keep that in mind.
Yes.
And the second thing is that testing is one part of a comprehensive strategy, and the whole strategy is described by testing, tracing, and supported isolation. So, once you have testing in place, it's really important to have highly effective contact tracing, either through hiring a large number of manual contact tracers or through using app-based testing, Bluetooth or GPS-based testing, which is designed in a way that protects privacy and civil liberties, because these are important issues in the United States and elsewhere. And there are companies and there are universities, including MIT, that are working on apps that allow location data to stay on people's phones while still tracing intersections and allowing warnings to be delivered to people who need to be tested. So that's the second part. The third part is supported isolation. So we call this TTSI, testing, tracing, and supported isolation. And once somebody is tested positive and they need to enter isolation, they have to be supported. They have to be provided with everything they need in order to sustain that isolation. In particular, their job has to be protected. That once they come out of isolation, they're not going to find themselves without a job. And while they're in isolation, they need to be supported, at least with regard to basic welfare, with regard to groceries and things like that. So, without that, people who test positive will still be out and about because they need to be, either because they need to show up at work, especially if they're asymptomatic, which a large number of people tend to be, maybe, between 20 and 40% are asymptomatic. They could easily enter the population, and be spreading the virus if they're desperate, if they don't, if they can't afford to lose their job, or they can't afford to lose their income, or they need to be, fending for themselves as far as food is concerned. So those are the 3 components. It's not just testing, although the headlines have focused on testing because the scale of testing is so large. But it's really a 3-pronged strategy: testing, tracing, and supported isolation.
And what do you think, what's your opinion about this Google and Apple alliance? Because they suggested they can create a kind of app that will trace our contacts.
Yeah, I think it's promising, but frankly, I don't know too many details about that. I know a bit more about the MIT app, the Safe Paths. From what I have heard, there are better apps under development, and the Google Apple app may well be one of those. But basically, the MIT app is extremely simple. All it does is it tracks your location every 5 minutes and stores it on your phone. It doesn't, distribute that or communicate that to anybody. But if you happen to test positive, you can transfer that location information to a healthcare provider who can then upload it with anonymizing, with identifying information removed. And that, because your location is now available centrally, that can be then transmitted to people's devices, and those with intersecting locations can then be warned. So, it's very simple. It's quite creative, and it protects privacy in a very credible way. People know that their privacy is being protected. It's not just that they have to take the word of Apple or Google or anybody, or MIT for that matter. And so that's, that seems to me the kind of thing that we need. Now, from what I've heard, there are better alternatives, but they have to basically follow this kind of structure. Bluetooth-based systems can also protect privacy in a credible way.
Mm-hmm. Is there any specific mathematical model of the pandemic which your prognosis is based on, your roadmap?
There are lots of models out there, and they disagree, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
That's a question I think I have to defer to the folks who are making the projections.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure which one of these carries more weight with regard to our projections about the implications of not following our plan. So
Mm-hmm.
so the models are not based on, they are not projections based on the adoption of the plan that we are proposing, right? So the models are giving us projections based on what we call a freeze in place scenario, which is, social distancing, and then it's relaxed after some time. Now there is a modeling effort underway. So we are trying to model both the freeze in place strategy and the TTSI strategy to look at the different implications of those, but that's at an early stage. So I don't think that formal models are informing our proposals at this point to the extent that they will in due course.
Right. Mm-hmm. And as I understand, the roadmap assumes that the active participants of the citizens, it has to be, the society has to be unified in a way. Am I correct? And that's the huge thing nowadays, because we are all divided so strongly. So how would you overcome this key?
This is fundamental. So Danielle Allen, whom I mentioned before, who really put this together, she has likened it to a wartime mobilization. And sometimes when societies face existential threats, they do have to come together, even if they're polarized, prior to the threat. We have been reaching out to people across the political spectrum, people who don't normally talk to each other. And we're willing to talk to anybody. And in fact, even in the construction of this plan, we tried to, or Danielle, I should say, tried to involve people from different parts of the political spectrum. We have been able to find an audience in many different places. There are endorsing institutions that are both on the right and the left. And of course, those that are nonpartisan or scientific, like the Santa Fe Institute. The Santa Fe Institute itself is one of the endorsers, subject to the caveats that they may not agree with everything in the report, of course. But it's encouraging to us that people across the political spectrum are listening and paying attention to this. But it's a heavy lift, Danielle is trying everything possible to try to get people, a broad spectrum of people on board. If that doesn't happen, then this is going to be very difficult. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. And it has to be coordinated centrally, as I understand, somehow. Or it can be realized in a somewhat fractal way. What's the...
Well, we think that this scale of mobilization, industrial mobilization, has to be managed centrally. So one of the proposals in the document is a pandemic testing board, composed of 9 people who are going to coordinate this centrally. And, the problem is, if it's done decentralized, in a decentralized way, at the level of cities or states, because of interstate movement, interstate commerce, it's not going to be sustainable. But more importantly, cities and states are just not able to finance these things. They are facing hard budget constraints right now. They're cutting expenses, actually. The non-emergency budget items are being cut drastically because they can't borrow in these markets, despite the support of the Federal Reserve. Cities and states are in desperate shape. And it's unfortunate that some folks, including the majority leader in the United States Senate, I don't want to be critical of anybody because of the need to build a broad coalition, but he has suggested the possibility that Congress may allow cities and states to go bankrupt. And that actually makes the problem much worse, because nobody will lend to some, an entity that has a reasonable chance of going bankrupt, even at high interest rates. And that will just squeeze the states and jurisdictions even harder at a time when they desperately need funding. So one thing I was very encouraged by was a statement today I saw by Gary Cohn, who was in the current administration previously. And he said, no, the federal assistance for state and local entities is absolutely essential. But even if that support comes, states and cities cannot do this on their own. It requires federal coordination. It requires federal financing. It requires federal support for this supported isolation. the funding for that has to come from the central government. The central government, the federal government, is the only entity that can borrow at large scale right now.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Partly assisted by the Federal Reserve.
Right.
Because if it wasn't for the Federal Reserve, even the Treasury would not be able to borrow.
Mm-hmm. And is it scalable? I mean, or is it universal, or is it context dependent? What I mean, can you apply those ideas to any other nation, any other country? Is it?
It's a fantastic question. And I just, yesterday with a group of people posted a paper. Our plan is based on a series of white papers that are posted on the website of the Safra Center. Yesterday, we posted a paper called Towards Global Pandemic Resilience. Now, that paper is focused on the global south. So it really looks in particular at India, Africa, and Latin America, which are countries which are facing very different conditions. They have more resource constraint, they have less ability to bid for supplies and equipment on the global markets. They have large, densely populated cities. They've got, large internal migration, at least in the case of India, with regard to their labor market. And, the plan we're proposing for the US is not transferable to those countries at all. It's not feasible. So we try in that paper to try to look at alternatives for the global south. Now, other countries like Europe and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, these countries, yes, they can adopt the TTSI model to some degree, and some have been doing. The East Asian countries in particular, so Taiwan, we are in some sense trying to emulate Taiwan, except that they have been preparing for 5 years since the last epidemic they faced. And we are really trying to, in an accelerated way, catch up with Taiwan. And, you could think of it that way. Singapore, South Korea, they have also adopted policies such as these, and these could be adopted in Europe as well. New Zealand has been very successful, but New Zealand has some natural advantages, and it blocked, incoming. It quarantined all its own citizens, and it blocked any non-citizens from coming in, and they have been really quite effective. But part of the reason for the effectiveness is also trust in governance institutions. And this has also been the case to some degree in Kerala in India, the state of Kerala in the south of India, and I think also in Vietnam. So you've got some pockets of sort of encouraging results, but it's not transferable to the global south. I will say that right away. And if you're interested, or your readers are interested,
they will.
You could look at the paper we posted yesterday. It's called Towards Global Pandemic Resilience, and it's on the, it's one of the series. It's the 11th in the series of white papers that the Safra Center has commissioned. There are a large number of co-authors on that. I won't go through the whole list right now, but you can see it over there.
Yeah, and you mentioned Singapore, and Singapore to me is quite a grim example, because they forgot about the forgotten. And the whole model, the whole method just collapsed because they forgot about those migrant workers, which were concentrated in those dormitories. And that's, what do you think about that? Because it's a kind of example that could be transferred into other contexts, I think, because
Yeah, I think that's right. In the United States right now, there's a big discussion about, who is dying and why. And in fact, the next white paper that I'm working on right now, it's very early stage right now. It's called Who is Dying and Why? And it really is looking at racial and ethnic disparities and socioeconomic disparities across the country, and what's driving them. Is it something, like the urban-rural divide, or is it, the fact that the essential workers are disproportionately belong to particular identity groups and socioeconomic categories? But we are looking at that. We're looking at that data right now. For Singapore, you're right. They had to repeat the lockdown, right? This is the wave scenario that we are fearing here in the United States. And that was with a very aggressive contact tracing technologies that are, Singapore, the citizens, at least it appears to me, are willing to tolerate invasions of privacy to a degree that, people in the United States would not. And despite that, you had the second wave in Singapore. So that's somewhat discouraging. But the basic strategy that they're putting in place, testing, contact tracing, if applied universally, if applied to the most vulnerable groups, you really want to be testing and tracing in the most vulnerable populations, because that's where you're going to show up most of the positive rates.
Mm-hmm. What also worries me about Singapore is the fact that they have this app which was designed by the government.
Yeah,
and only 20% of the population decided to use this app.
that's right.
And that's the huge question, because if we have such an app produced by MIT or somebody else, and then nobody uses it, it just it's a useless tool.
Excellent point. In fact, that's right. In fact, you need people to be using. You need, we think about 80% usage, and you need that to be concentrated, in particular locations. So, for example, if people just use it in urban areas, that's fine. We can do manual tracing for rural areas. But you're right. There's no point in people using an app if other people are not using the app, and so you have this sort of race to the bottom. It's it's a waste of your time to be involved in the strategy unless other people also adopt it. So that's a big problem, and that's why I think we are emphasizing manual contact tracing at the moment. And the reason is also because we have to have in the US opt-in, an opt-in approach to app-based tracing. You can't force people to be doing this, and if it's opt-in and if it's got low usage, low pickup, low take up, then it's not going to do a whole lot of good. Yeah, that's right.
And that will be an extremely naive kind of question, because I'm a physicist by training, not an economist. And what kind of methods or schemes do you use while estimating the costs of such scenarios, those three basic scenarios that you mentioned in the plan?
So, first of all, these are estimates with a fair amount of uncertainty. We can't estimate these things very precisely. For estimates for the current scenario, loss of output, that's not too hard, really. You can see how much GDP is going down, the unemployment rate, the claims for unemployment insurance, and so on. You've got economic activity contracting, and that has direct measurable costs because we measure economic activity directly. With regard to the costs of the alternative that we are proposing, there are estimates about the cost of ramping up the testing infrastructure. You have already a testing infrastructure. So, you have some idea of what it costs, per test. And you can scale it up, sublinearly, in anticipation of the fact that, as you increase the scale, you're going to get some increasing returns to scale. But again, these are back of the envelope calculations. They should be treated as such. But the order of magnitude difference, the cost difference between what we are proposing, which is about 300 billion over 2 years, versus the output loss we are experiencing right now per month, which is roughly in that range, is so great that even despite the uncertainties, we're quite confident that the program we are proposing is going to save costs, and it will also save lives.
Mm-hmm. And the very last question, because we both come from, we were born in the countries which we are quite used to utopias, because India, as I understand, is a kind of land where utopias or utopian ideas were attempted to be realized in a way. Gandhi and all those projects, huge social projects and political projects, and Poland too. I mean, the Eastern Europe is a place where all those utopias just collapsed quite recently. And this project is so huge, but it has those traces of being a kind of utopia. I mean, it's so fundamentally humongous. And what's your attitude?
I think you're right that there is a flavor of that. I think you're right. But again, to go back to the analogy that Danielle Allen has been promoting, which is, what can you accomplish if you adopt the mentality that we are at war and we need a wartime mobilization? Many things have been accomplished by societies under those kinds of conditions. I wouldn't say, utopian accomplishments, because they're temporary, mobilizations that achieve particular specifically defined goals, and that unity will eventually lapse, once the crisis is behind us. So it's not quite utopian, but I will say this, that many of these kinds of crises, the Second World War, for example, in Britain, and the Great Depression in the United States, led to fundamental changes in society. So, for example, Social Security in the United States and various other changes in the relationship between the government and the citizen were implemented in an enduring way in the Great Depression, and they survived till today. In the United Kingdom, the National Health Service was conceived and formed, through the process of mobilization in the Second World War. And this is a project actually that I'm trying to think about also, about the enduring effects of this crisis, because we have been focused so much on getting past it. But we're not going to be back in, after it's all done, we're not going to be back with the same economy or the same society. People are not going to spend their money on the same kinds of goods and services. There'll be differences. We don't know exactly how yet. But we're also not going to be back with the same society. We'll have been through something together that makes certain things feasible and other things not. And I haven't thought a whole lot about that yet, since we're focused on the most urgent needs, but I think that there will be big effects. And I don't know whether they take us, closer or further away from any kind of utopian ideal, but I can imagine certain changes being beneficial, in the long term.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed that.